Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug that didn't make soldiers braver. It just made fear stop registering. Not courage, not discipline, just the part of the brain that says maybe don't do that. Quieted, like a radio turned down until you forget it's there. But the strange part is, this drug wasn't made for soldiers to feel fearless. It was made for children to feel normal. And somehow, decades later, it was moving quietly through war zones, funding a dictatorship, and making soldiers feel like nothing could stop them. Tonight we're tracing how a children's medicine became a $6 billion criminal economy, and how a pill that made people unstoppable also made them impossible to control. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now, perhaps tucked under a blanket halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Here's the thing nobody tells you about feeling invincible. It doesn't feel like a drug. It feels like waking up as yourself, except all the parts that used to slow you down have quietly stepped aside. It's 2 a.m. and you've been awake since yesterday. Not the yesterday that means last night, the yesterday before that. You're sitting against a wall in a building you didn't know existed 3 weeks ago, in a city you couldn't have found on a map 6 months ago, wearing boots that have stopped feeling like boots and started feeling like feet. Around you, some of the other men in the unit are sleeping, genuinely, completely sleeping. Rifles across their laps, chins dropped. Their bodies doing the thing bodies are designed to do when there's no more to be done. You watch them the way you watch something you used to be able to do without thinking. You haven't slept properly in 4 days. Not because you couldn't, because there was always something, a rotation, a shift. The sounds that come through walls in places like this that need to be sorted into the ones that mean something and the ones that don't. You're still learning to sort them. Somewhere outside, something moves. You don't know what. You file it under the second category and hope you're right. In a few hours, you're going out again. This is your third operation. The first one, your hands shook so badly, you had to hold them together on your weapon to stop the noise. The second one, you were sick twice before you left. Just nerves. Just the body filing a complaint that nobody asked for. The waiting is the hardest part. Once you're moving, the shaking stops. You know this from both times. Movement is easier than waiting, and your body has figured this out. The briefing was 2 hours ago. You've run through it 11 times since. Not because you've forgotten anything, but because your brain has decided that reviewing it is better than whatever it would be doing otherwise. You know what it would be doing otherwise. You adjust the strap on your kit. It doesn't need adjusting. You adjusted it 9 minutes ago. You've tried things. You tried the breathing technique, which someone taught you and which works for approximately 30 seconds before your nervous system remembers what it knows and reasserts its position. You tried not thinking about it. Not thinking about something is its own kind of thinking about it, which you knew before you tried and tried anyway, because the alternatives were worse. The man across from you has been on 5 operations. He looks like he's waiting for a bus. You've been watching him for an hour and you still don't know how a person gets that calm. The man beside you doesn't say anything. He just reaches into his chest pocket, the way someone reaches for a lighter when they see you looking for one, and holds his hand out toward you. Small, round, white, smooth on the fingertip the way pharmaceutical things are smooth, pressed properly, manufactured somewhere with the right equipment. A number on one face that means nothing to you. Looks like aspirin. Looks like what your mother kept in the cabinet above the bathroom sink, next to the plasters and the travel sickness tablets. You take it. You wait. And then, gradually something begins to loosen. It starts in your chest. The tightening that has been running since the briefing. The low, persistent thing underneath everything. The signal your body has been sending that has nowhere to go. It starts to lose its argument. Not gone. Further away. Like it moved to the back of a room you're no longer standing in. Your shoulders drop. You didn't notice them rising. They've been up for 4 days, apparently, holding something they were asked to hold without being told what it was or when they could put it down. Your mind clears. Not the jittery false clarity of too much coffee, where thoughts run fast and trip over each other and your hands need to be doing something. Calmer. The version of thinking that exists when nothing is running underneath it. The version you remember from before all this, when thoughts went where you pointed them. The briefing. You run through it once. Clean. Complete. Every step in the right place. The way a sequence sits when nothing is interfering. The tiredness is gone. The fear is gone. What's left is something you don't have a word for yet. Not courage. Not confidence. Not the feeling of being ready in the way you imagined ready would feel. Just a kind of clarity. A steadiness. The sense that your body and the task ahead of it are finally in agreement, and nothing in between them is arguing anymore. You pick up your weapon. You've carried this for 3 weeks and you know its weight the way you know the weight of your own arm. Tonight it feels like nothing. You stand, and your legs don't argue and your hands don't ask permission, and the man who handed you the pill is already on his feet and moving, and you fall in beside him without deciding to. You're going to do what you came here to do, not because you have to, but because there is nothing in you right now that says don't. The story of how this got here starts not with a war, not with a cartel, not with a ruined city. It starts with a team of chemists in West Germany who had a genuinely good idea. In 1961, a company called Degussa AG was working on a problem. Amphetamine existed. It had existed since the 1930s. The medical world knew what it could do: sharpen focus, eliminate fatigue, suppress appetite, treat attention disorders and narcolepsy and depression. The problem was the edges. Amphetamine was rough. It came on hard and left hard. The cardiovascular stress, the anxiety, the crash that arrived like a bill you forgot to pay, the potential for misuse that made physicians nervous even when they were prescribing it legitimately. What if, the Degussa chemists thought, you could keep the function and soften the edges? They created phenethylline. The technical beauty of it was this. Phenethylline was a prodrug. You took it orally, and it sat in your stomach doing almost nothing until your liver got to it. The liver, which did not ask for this assignment, processed it anyway. Then the body broke it apart into 2 separate compounds, amphetamine and theophylline, a caffeine-adjacent bronchodilator used in asthma treatment. 2 stimulants, 2 different mechanisms, both arriving in the bloodstream together, smoothly, as if the drug had given them both a schedule and told them to coordinate. The result was longer lasting, gentler on the heart than straight amphetamine, and less likely to produce that jittery, sparking pressure cooker feeling that made some patients feel worse rather than better. They named it Captagon. It sounded clinical, reliable, like a word that would not cause problems. They were correct about this for approximately 25 years. The ideal patient for Captagon, as the pharmaceutical literature described them, was a child who could not sit still. A boy, usually in the early framing. This was the 1960s, and the medical establishment had a narrow imagination about who attention problems afflicted. He couldn't focus in class, he couldn't finish tasks, he lost things, he interrupted. He was, by the standards of post-war European education, a problem to be solved. Captagon was one of the solutions. The literature also named adults with narcolepsy, people who fell asleep without warning in the middle of their daily lives, people with depression so heavy it had stolen the energy needed to treat itself, patients whose fatigue had become a diagnosis. Across Europe and the Middle East through the 1960s and 1970s, doctors wrote prescriptions, pharmacies stocked the white pills, patients took them and reported with the quiet gratitude of people who'd been struggling for a long time that things were better. By the 1970s, Captagon had travelled east with the pharmaceutical trade routes. The Middle East was a natural market. The region had strong relationships with European pharmaceutical companies. The drug was available legally. In some countries, Lebanon, Jordan, parts of the Gulf, it sat on pharmacy shelves with no more restriction than aspirin, and it found a constituency nobody had put in the marketing brochure: students. The MENA region has always had an examination culture of unusual intensity. The baccalaureate in Lebanon, the Tawjihi in Jordan, the Thanawiyya Amma in Egypt. These tests were not assessments, they were sorting machines. The grade you earned would determine what kind of life you were going to have. The pressure that descended during exam season had weight you could almost feel in the air. Lebanese students, Jordanian students, Egyptian students, Palestinian students. If you were serious about university, you were serious about the exam, and if you were serious about the exam, you needed to study. You needed to study for a very long time. You needed to study through the night. And this white pill from Germany, still available legally at the pharmacy 2 streets over, which, in the context of what it was doing to the brain, was a remarkable place to keep it, did something remarkable. It let you. This is not a story about reckless youth making bad choices. This is a story about students doing exactly what students have always done when the pressure is high enough, reaching for whatever works. In the 1970s, in Beirut and Amman and Cairo, what worked was Captagon. Exams passed. University places were earned. The pill became woven into the culture of academic stress, the way all-nighters and caffeine and the particular desperation of a textbook at 3 a.m. are woven into student culture everywhere. Normal. The qualities that made it useful for a student. No sleep, no fear, no doubt, the sense that you could keep going long past the point where the body said stop, were the same qualities that would interest, in a few decades, a very different kind of employer. Then something arrived that tends to change how the world thinks about things. A rule, not a scandal, not a crisis, not a moment where the world recoiled, just a meeting, bureaucrats and health officials. A committee that had been watching stimulant trends across multiple countries and had reached a conclusion. The conclusion was, this is being misused. Students using it to study were not the concern. Students using it to study were, in a technical sense, using it exactly as intended. It improved focus and reduced fatigue, which is what it said on the label. The concern was abuse potential, dependency. The recognised pattern of amphetamine-type stimulants being used in ways that caused harm, which was a legitimate concern, and also, like many legitimate concern acted upon by international committees, produced consequences that nobody had fully modelled. In 1986, the United Nations concluded that phenethylene had significant abuse potential and should be placed under international control. The Convention on Psychotropic Substances was updated. Phenethylene was scheduled. The legal pharmaceutical industry, which had been making Captagon properly and transparently for 25 years, was required to stop. In the years that followed, the factories closed. The pharmacies cleared their shelves. The prescriptions stopped being written. The International Narcotics Control Board reported the legitimate market wound down. The document closes. The minutes are filed. A bureaucrat somewhere stamps a form. All done. Problem solved. The committee did not model what would happen next. Committees rarely do. Except the students still had exams. The workers still had shifts. The people who had found something that helped them function, they were still there, still needing the help, and the official source had simply been removed. This is a pattern that has repeated itself so many times, across so many substances, across so many centuries, that it almost qualifies as a law. Not a law like gravity, A law like Murphy's, when you prohibit something that a large number of people want, you do not extinguish the want, you relocate it. The want moves from licensed, taxed, regulated, trackable channels into unlicensed, untaxed, unregulated, untrackable ones. The pharmacist who used to sell Captagon over the counter closes his display case. The man at the back of the market opens his. The UN committee had been watching stimulant trends. The stimulant trends were about to get considerably more interesting. There is a principle that applies very reliably when you prohibit something that enough people want. You don't eliminate the supply, you change who controls it. By the late 1980s, production had moved underground. And here is where the story develops its first dark comedy, because the pills that continued to circulate under the name Captagon were increasingly not Captagon. Real phenethylline, the original molecule, the carefully designed prodrug, was no longer being synthesized anywhere legal. The precursor, chemicals, were controlled. The manufacturing know-how lived in pharmaceutical company files that were no longer being consulted. What filled the gap was simpler, cheaper, less elegant: amphetamine, caffeine, fillers, pressed into the same round tablet with the same stamped number. Sold under the same name, the brand survived the product. Captagon became a brand, like Hoover, like Jacuzzi. Except instead of vacuum cleaners and hot tubs, the product was amphetamine mixed with caffeine and whatever else the factory had on hand that day. You were buying a reputation, a rumour, a story that someone had turned into a pill shape and sold you for $5. Whether what was in the pill matched what the user expected was almost beside the point. The belief did half the work anyway. This is how drug markets function in the absence of quality control. The product is whatever the seller says it is. The name carries the reputation. The reputation carries the effect. A student in 1988 buying a white pill labelled Captagon was buying 25 years of quiet, useful, medically supervised history condensed into a shape. The pharmacological reality inside the pill had changed. The story on the outside hadn't. And stories, as it turned out, were extremely profitable. By the 1990s, production had consolidated in Eastern Europe. Bulgaria became a significant manufacturing hub. The pills moved through Turkey into Arab Gulf states, via networks that also handled hashish and other contraband. Logistics, routes, the invisible infrastructure of a thing that a lot of people want, and not many want to admit wanting. The Gulf states were ideal markets: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait. Wealthy populations with strict prohibition on alcohol, the world's most reliable contraband market driver, and a cultural framework in which stimulants that didn't smell like alcohol were easier to use discreetly. Billions of pills. The scale was already enormous, and it was still growing. Then 2011 arrived, and a country called Syria started to break apart in ways that would change almost everything about this story. But before that, one more thing about the 1990s and 2000s that is worth understanding. The scale was already much larger than anyone in 1986 had imagined it would be. By the mid-2000s, seizures in Saudi Arabia ran into the tens of millions of pills per year. Jordan's border police were pulling shipments out of trucks regularly. The Gulf states were watching a consumer market for a cheap available stimulant grow steadily year on year, driven by the same forces that had driven it since the 1970s. Exam pressure, work pressure, the particular usefulness of a drug that helped you keep going without the smell of alcohol or the obvious visual signs of other substances. Captagon had become, without much fanfare, one of the dominant drugs in the Arab world. It was doing this quietly, under the radar, moving in the background of a region that had other things to worry about. And then those other things arrived, all at once, and the background became the foreground. The Syrian civil war began in March 2011 as protests. Young people, mostly inspired by the Arab Spring, asking for reforms. The Assad government responded the way the Assad government responded to things: tanks, arrests, snipers on rooftops in Daraa. The protests became an uprising. The uprising became a war. The war spread into every corner of a country of 22 million people and refused to stop. By 2012, the cities that had functioned for thousands of years, Aleppo, Homs, Deir ez-Zor, were becoming unrecognizable. And the war, like every war, required something. It required fighters. And fighters, it would turn out, required something too. What a fighter in a civil war needs is a very specific list. No sleep. Or at least much less sleep than a human being normally requires, because war doesn't pause for the circadian rhythm. No hunger, because logistics collapse. In conflict and meals become irregular. No fear. This is the complicated one. Fear is a survival mechanism. Fear tells you to take cover, to hesitate, to retreat from things that will kill you. Fear is, from an evolutionary perspective, correct. But a commander who needs a checkpoint held doesn't benefit from evolutionarily correct fighters. He benefits from fighters who will hold it regardless. No doubt. The moral arithmetic of war, the calculation every person makes about what they are able to do and what they cannot, is an obstacle in certain contexts. Doubt slows things down. The Syrian conflict was becoming a context in which all of these human qualities, sleep need, hunger, fear, doubt, were liabilities. It was a Captagon-shaped problem, and Captagon, or the amphetamine mixture that wore its name, was already present in the region. The pills began appearing in fighter supply chains. The logic was not complicated. If you are commanding a militia and you need fighters, who will stay awake, hold positions, not retreat, not hesitate, and not stop to process what they are doing at the ethical level. And if a pill that accomplishes most of this is available and cheap, and your fighters have been using it recreationally anyway, the calculation has a fairly obvious answer. It is the same calculation armies have made repeatedly throughout the 20th century. The British military used amphetamines in World War II. So did the Americans, so did the Germans, so did the Japanese. The logic was identical. War asks more of a human body than a human body can sustainably provide, and stimulants bridge the gap. The Syrian conflict was not novel in this respect. It was just the latest iteration of a very old partnership between warfare and the chemistry of human endurance. The first documented accounts came from journalists working in Syria in 2013 and 2014. A reporter from Time magazine spoke to a rebel fighter who described being given pills before operations. Small, round, white. The fighter described entering firefights feeling nothing that he would normally feel. No shaking, no hesitation. He described it as clarity, as certainty. Other accounts followed. Fighters who had been captured, aid workers who had treated combatants. A pattern assembled itself out of disconnected testimonies. The pilots, the analysts, the combat observers all described the same phenomenon. Fighters who appeared to feel no pain, who didn't behave the way people in firefights normally behave, who, in some cases, were laughing. This was considered, by the commanders distributing the pills, a satisfactory outcome. This is the part of the story that caught the world's attention, and it is real. Stimulants, proper amphetamines properly dosed, do suppress fear. They suppress the amygdala's automatic threat response. They raise the threshold at which pain becomes an obstacle. They reduce the hesitation that comes from imagining consequences. The body still experiences the injury. The brain just processes its significance differently. A Captagon-dosed fighter is not superhuman. He is a human whose biological warning systems have been partially muted, which is not the same thing, but in the specific theatre of a firefight, the functional difference can be significant. What nobody in the early reporting paused to emphasise was that the pills didn't have an ideology. They were found on government forces, they were found on rebel fighters, they were found in territory held by multiple different factions, some of whom were fighting each other, ISIS-affiliated fighters, Assad loyalist militias, various rebel coalitions operating under different flags and different command structures, all of them in different contexts documented using stimulants that matched the profile of what was circulating under the Captagon name. This is not a drug that chose a side. This is a drug that war itself reached for. War has always reached for this. The specific molecule changes. The underlying transaction doesn't. Human bodies have limits. War exceeds those limits, and chemistry has always been available to bridge the distance. The fighter in Aleppo in 2013 was not doing something unprecedented. He was doing something ancient in a new context, with a pill that had started its life in a West German laboratory, designed for children who couldn't sit still in class. The gap between those two uses is 60 years and several categories of human tragedy, and it was about to get significantly worse. A drug that makes you feel like nothing can hurt you doesn't ask which flag you're carrying. It doesn't check credentials. It doesn't require authorization from command. It just works. And when a tool that war has found useful is already being manufactured by the billions somewhere nearby, in a country that no longer has the infrastructure to do much of anything except survive, the economics are not complicated. Syria had pharmaceutical infrastructure. Before the war, the country had a functional domestic pharmaceutical industry, factories, equipment, supply chains for raw materials, technicians who knew how to operate the machinery. Syria had been producing legitimate generic medications for decades. A mid-size industry, nothing remarkable. The kind of manufacturing base a developing country builds over 50 years of trying to be self-sufficient in healthcare. The war destroyed the legitimate economy. It did not destroy the factories. It did not disappear the technicians. It simply changed what the factories were being asked to produce. And in the territory where the Assad government retained control, someone with access to those factories, someone with the power to protect them, to supply them with precursor chemicals, to ensure the product moved through customs and across borders without interference, was paying attention. The Assad family had survived decades in power through a very reliable method, controlling the things that other people needed and charging accordingly. They had controlled the army, the security services, the media, the food supply during sieges. Now they were going to control the pills. What they were about to build was not a cartel hiding from the government. It was a government that was the cartel, and the scale of what was coming would make everything that had come before look like a student study habit. The Assad family had been running Syria since 1970. Hafez al-Assad took power in a coup, held it for 30 years, passed it to his son Bashar in 2000, in what official Syrian state media described as a democratic election, and everyone else described as an inheritance arranged while the body was still warm. The family had a method. It was not subtle, but it was effective. You controlled the army. You controlled the security services, the multiple, overlapping security services, each one watching the others, because even in a dictatorship, trust is a resource you spend carefully. You distributed key positions among people whose survival was structurally linked to yours, relatives, members of the Alawite minority that the Assad family came from, men who had been given enough power to be useful and enough vulnerability to be controllable. You gave friends contracts. You punished dissent with imprisonment or disappearance. The Meza prison outside Damascus, the Tadmor military prison in Palmyra, which had the specific reputation of a place where people went and didn't come back. You made it so that everyone with power had something to lose if you fell, and everyone without power knew exactly what happened to people who made noise. It is, if you remove the prisons and the disappearances, a perfectly reasonable management philosophy. For 40 years, it worked. And then 2011 arrived, and the Arab Spring swept through the region, and something that had never quite happened before happened in Syria. Ordinary people in a mid-sized city called Dera started protesting, and the government shot at them, and instead of going home, more people came out. The Assad government responded to the uprising the way it had always responded to threats: tanks, snipers, mass arrests, siege of neighbourhoods, barrel bombs dropped on apartment buildings, chemical weapons in Ghouta in 2013, an event so clearly documented that the international community spent 2 weeks discussing what to do, and then did approximately nothing. The war expanded. By 2013, it was not a protest crackdown anymore. It was a multi-sided conflict involving the Syrian army, dozens of rebel groups, Kurdish militias, ISIS, and eventually the military forces of Russia, Iran, Turkey, and the United States, all operating in the same theatre, mostly without coordinating with each other. 22 million people lived in Syria before the war. By 2015, half of them had moved, either internally displaced or across borders into Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Europe. It was one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of the 21st century. And in the middle of it, Captagon was growing into an industry. The economics of wartime Syria in 2012 and 2013 was straightforward in the way that ruined economies become straightforward. The formal sector had collapsed. Foreign investment was gone. Tourism, which had actually been recovering in Syria through the 2000s, was gone. Oil revenue. Syria had never been a major producer, but it had enough to matter, was reduced by sanctions and physical damage to infrastructure. The Syrian pound was losing value month by month, which is a polite way of saying that people's savings were being quietly consumed by a fire they couldn't put out. The businesses that employed the middle class were destroyed or abandoned. The professional class was leaving. Doctors, engineers, academics. The people who could leave, left. What remained was what always remains when formal economies fail: the informal ones. Hashish had been cultivated in parts of Syria for decades. The Kalamun Mountains, the Bekaa adjacent territories. Small-scale smuggling networks had always existed. The Lebanese-Syrian border was one of the most reliably porous borders in the world, and not because the terrain was impassable. It was porous because both sides had decided, at various times and for various reasons, that being porous was more useful than being sealed. But hashish was slow and bulky, and the margins, while reasonable, were not extraordinary. Captagon was different. The production cost of a single Captagon pill, the amphetamine precursors, the binders, the pressing, the packaging, was a fraction of a cent. Less than a fraction of a cent at scale, when you weren't paying for legitimate pharmaceutical oversight. The street price in Saudi Arabia was between $5 and $25 per pill, depending on the market and the buyer. Between those two numbers, the fraction of a cent on one end and the $5 to $25 on the other, lay one of the most extraordinary profit margins in the global drug trade. Every shipment was a vast multiplication of almost nothing into something considerable. In the pharmaceutical industry, this is called a markup. In Syria in 2013, it was called a survival strategy. And unlike hashish, the pills were small, easy to conceal, and immune to agricultural fluctuations. The people who first scaled this up in Syria were not the Assad family. They were entrepreneurs of necessity, factory owners and managers in regime-held territory who saw the economics and made a calculation that was, in context, not unreasonable. The country was destroyed. The legitimate business was gone. The equipment still worked. The people who knew how to operate it still needed to eat. Small-time smugglers who had existing relationships with the Gulf distribution networks made the same calculation from the other end. Men who had been moving hashish across the Lebanese border for 20 years understood the infrastructure needed to move something smaller and more valuable. The trucks were already making the trips. The border contacts were already established, the fees were already understood. What changed was the cargo, and the cargo changed fast. The pill presses started running in Homs, in parts of the Damascus countryside, in facilities that had previously made cough syrup and blood pressure, medication, and were now making something rather more interesting and considerably more profitable. In the Kalamoon region, where the mountains provided cover and the valleys provided roads and the proximity to Lebanon provided exit routes. The product was simple. The demand was enormous. The geography was favourable. Syria shares borders with Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon and Israel. The Lebanese border in particular in the Bekaa Valley had been a smuggling corridor since before anyone currently alive could remember. Drugs moved north to south, weapons moved south to north. The trucks moved both ways, and the border guards had, over generations, developed a calibrated interest in looking at paperwork rather than cargo. The network was already there, it just needed someone with enough power to consolidate it, protect it, and take a percentage that reflected the protection being offered. In a country run by the Assad family, there was never much ambiguity about who that someone would be. Maher al-Assad is Bashar's younger brother, where Bashar is careful and quiet. The ophthalmologist who became a president trained in London, measured in his public statements, precise in his formal presentation, the kind of leader whose wife once appeared in a Vogue profile that described their family as bringing a rare Western-educated sensibility to Damascus. Maher is not those things. Maher does not give Vogue interviews. Maher commands the 4th Armoured Division. In the Syrian military hierarchy, this is the most powerful unit in the army. The 4th Division does not answer to the normal chain of command in the way that other divisions do. It answers to Maher. It is, functionally, a private army within a state army. Elite equipment, elite access. The unit that gets deployed when the regular army needs what might be politely described as a more decisive approach. Maher's personal reputation was established early. In 1999, he shot his brother-in-law in the leg during a family argument. His brother-in-law was Asef Shawkat, who would later become the Syrian Minister of Defense. In most families, shooting your brother-in-law in the leg would produce consequences. In the Assad family, it produced a conversation. Maher kept his position. In the Syrian conflict, the 4th Division was deployed in some of the most brutal operations of the war. The Siege of Daraya, operations in Homs, the kind of conduct that generates reports from the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria. And that commission has written a considerable number of reports. Maher was not tried. He was promoted. In 2023, the United States Treasury added Maher al-Assad to its sanctions list specifically for his role in Captagon production and trafficking. The 4th Armoured Division was named alongside him. This was the formal acknowledgement of something that investigators and journalists had been documenting for years. The man who ran the army in regime territory was also the man who ran the drug trade in regime territory. The protection, the production, the distribution, all of it flowed through the same organisational structure. The 4th Division controlled the checkpoints through which trucks left Syria. The 4th Division controlled the territory where the factories operated. The 4th Division was the difference between a Captagon factory being raided and a Captagon factory being protected. Maher didn't need to own the factories. He just needed to be the reason they could operate. What Maher brought to the Captagon trade was not the idea and not the infrastructure. Both of those already existed. What he brought was protection. And in Syria, protection was not a service you hired. It was a relationship you entered. A pill factory in regime-held Syria, operating without the blessing of the 4th Division, was a pill factory that could be raided, shut down, taxed to death, or simply taken over at any time by people with better weapons than the factory owner. The state security apparatus in Syria was, under the Assads, a revenue-generating system as much as a governance system. It shook down businesses. It extracted fees for operation. It decided who could operate and who couldn't. A pill factory that paid into the right networks and operated under the right umbrella was a pill factory that could produce indefinitely, receive precursor chemical shipments from suppliers who knew exactly where to send them without being intercepted, and move product through regime checkpoints in trucks whose cargo would not be examined. This is what organised crime at the state level looks like. Not a shadowy figure running operations from a warehouse. Not a cartel that bribes officials and hopes the payments hold. A general in uniform commanding the army division that controls the territory where the factories sit, whose organisational structure the production and distribution runs through. The factories didn't need to bribe the government. The government issued them their operating licence. This is sometimes called vertical integration. Business schools teach it as an efficiency model. The distinction matters. Cartels in Mexico or Colombia operate in tension with the state. Sometimes they capture officials, sometimes they fight the state, but the state is always a separate entity. Syria under the Assad drug operation was something different. There was no tension, there was no negotiation, there was one power structure, and the drug trade was integrated into it the same way the army was integrated into it. This is why sanctions against individual named figures like Maher, while symbolically significant, have limited practical impact. You cannot sanction an organisational structure. You can name a person. The structure continues without needing his name on a building. By 2015, production in regime-held Syria had scaled to a level that would have been difficult to imagine 5 years earlier. The estimates are necessarily imprecise. Nobody was filing annual reports with the Syrian Securities Commission, but investigators tracking seizure data across the region began to piece together a picture. The seizures were the visible fraction of what was actually moving. If customs in Jordan intercepts a truck and finds 2 million pills, the reasonable assumption is that the same smuggling network has moved many trucks that were not intercepted. The interdiction rate for drug shipments globally runs somewhere between 5 and 20%, which means that for every pill seized, 4 to 19 pills arrived. The math was alarming. The pill total moving out of Syria annually was not in the millions, it was in the billions. The transit infrastructure ran through Lebanon. The relationship between the Assad government and Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia, political and military organisation, had been close for decades. Syria had long served as a transit corridor for Iranian weapons reaching Hezbollah, and the two organisations had fought alongside each other in the Syrian conflict beginning in 2013. The relationship extended to commercial interests. Hezbollah's presence in the Bekaa Valley, which runs along the Syria-Lebanon border, was not incidental. The Bekaa had been a centre of hashish cultivation and drug transit for generations. Hezbollah had economic interests in that corridor that were as old as the organisation itself. The Captagon route from Syrian factories into Lebanon, and from Lebanon to maritime shipping or overland routes into the Gulf, ran through networks where Hezbollah participation was documented by multiple intelligence agencies and formalised in US Treasury sanctions on specific named individuals. This was not moonlighting, it was integration. The political organisation, the military wing and the drug, transit logistics all ran in the same territory under the same command. The destination, overwhelmingly, was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the largest country in the Arabian Peninsula by land area, the largest economy in the Arab world, the custodian of Islam's two holiest cities, and the world's most significant market for illicit Captagon. These facts coexist without apparent irony in official Saudi communications. The kingdom banned alcohol in 1952. The logic was religious and social. Alcohol produces disorder. Disorder is incompatible with an Islamic state. Therefore, alcohol is prohibited. The prohibition has held, publicly, for 70 years. What the prohibition also produced, with the reliable logic of every substance ban in human history, was a large population with disposable income, strong cultural pressure against visible intoxication, and an unmet desire for something that could alter the texture of an evening without being smelled on the breath, observed as visibly unsteady behaviour, or detected in a glass by a disapproving family member. Captagon fit this gap the way a key fits a lock that has been waiting for it. Odourless, portable, socially neutral in appearance. Pills look like medication, not vice. A stimulant that made you more talkative and energetic rather than visibly impaired. Something you could take at a gathering and appear to simply be in a good mood. Something that let you stay up for a 20-hour work shift without attracting the kind of concern that a visibly intoxicated worker would attract. It was also, relative to the Gulf's substantial disposable income, remarkably cheap. $5 per pill, $10 in some markets. Even at $25, a single evening's worth was less than a restaurant bill. The consumer profile was diverse in a way that the jihad drug framing entirely missed. Construction workers from South Asia labouring on Riyadh's endless building projects. Young Saudi men at private parties. Students at King Abdulaziz University with exams approaching. Truck drivers on overnight hauls between Riyadh and Jeddah. Different lives, different contexts, the same white pill, tens of millions of pills per year moving into the kingdom. These are the seized numbers, which represent the fraction that was caught. The actual consumption was a multiple of whatever the customs data showed. Jordan had its own version of this problem, compressed by geography. The Jordanian border with Syria is short and historically difficult to secure. The smuggling was not casual, it was industrial. Trucks, tunnels, paid border officials, purpose-built concealment. Jordan's security services, which are genuinely capable, were straining against a volume of product that exceeded what enforcement resources could absorb. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, both American allies, both suffering from the overflow of Assad's drug economy, began applying pressure on Washington to do something visible. Washington, for once, responded relatively quickly. The scale of what was happening became visible in 2021. Saudi customs officials at the port of Jeddah were processing a shipment of pomegranates from Syria. Pomegranates are grown in Syria. They are a normal agricultural export. The paperwork was in order. The truck had come through the expected route. The documentation described fruit, and there was indeed fruit inside. The X-ray machine disagreed with the paperwork about what else was inside. Each pomegranate had been individually hollowed out, the seeds removed, the interior packed with white tablets, the pomegranate reassembled to look, from the outside, like a pomegranate. Someone, somewhere in Syria, had sat down and worked out that a pomegranate could hold a predictable number of pills, multiplied that number by however many pomegranates fit in a truck, and arrived at a figure that justified the labour of hollowing out each piece of fruit by hand. The math worked out to 14 million Captagon tablets. 14 million in fruit. The customs officer who logged the seizure presumably paused for a moment before writing the number down, then wrote it down anyway, because there it was. 14 million pills in one shipment, from one country, inside individual pieces of agricultural produce, on one day, caught by one inspection. The entire global seizure record for Captagon had been broken by a pomegranate delivery, and everyone who knew how drug shipments worked understood the same thing simultaneously. If 14 million pills were in this shipment, this was not the shipment they were most worried about. This was the one they found. The worry was about the geometry of what they hadn't found. If this truck was caught, what was the reasonable estimate of how many trucks weren't? How many orange shipments, furniture containers, machinery crates, car parts, pallets, industrial equipment boxes had moved through in the preceding months without an X-ray, catching the geometry? The answer, by the standard models used to estimate drug interdiction rates, was a great many. The response from the international community was, in the manner of international communities confronting inconvenient facts, gradual. The United States had been watching Syria's Captagon trade with increasing concern. The Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and Jordan, were pressuring their American counterparts to do something. Jordan, sharing a long and difficult border with Syria, was experiencing significant Captagon trafficking pressure and watching its own enforcement resources strain under the volume. The diplomatic problem was that the person most responsible for the trade was a head of state. Bashar al-Assad was not a cartel leader. He was the internationally recognized government of Syria, however tenuously. His brother Maher commanded his army. The factories were in his territory. The protection networks were his networks, sanctioning Maher al-Assad, which the United States eventually did in April 2023, adding him specifically to the specially designated nationals list for Captagon trafficking, was largely symbolic. Maher al-Assad did not have assets in American banks. He did not travel to New York. The sanction said, "We know." It didn't say, "We can stop you." Meanwhile, the Arab League was having a meeting. The Arab League had suspended Syria's membership in 2011 when the Assad government started dropping barrel bombs on its own cities. This was considered at the time a firm statement, the Arab world's premier regional organization refusing to seat the Syrian delegation, a diplomatic consequence. Assad had continued dropping barrel bombs. By 2023, various member states, primarily those with interest in regional stability, and secondarily those whose customs officials were exhausted from processing pomegranate seizures, were arguing for readmission. The argument was the one that always gets made when engagement versus isolation debates happen in diplomatic circles. If Assad is inside the tent, he can be pressured. If he's outside the tent, he cannot be pressured at all, and he has now been outside for 12 years, and the bombs have not stopped and the pills have not stopped, and perhaps a different approach is warranted. The counter-argument was equally predictable. He has been outside for 12 years and has not changed his behaviour in any meaningful way, and there is no particular reason to believe that a seat at a regional summit will produce results that 12 years of exclusion did not. The Arab League voted for readmission in May 2023. Assad attended the summit in Jeddah. He shook hands with Mohammed bin Salman, whose country was the primary destination for Assad's primary export. There are photographs of this handshake. They are remarkable photographs for reasons that the photographers may or may not have fully appreciated. The condition, stated publicly, was that Assad would address the Captagon trade. Assad nodded. He was very good at nodding. The factories kept running. The Arab League issued a follow-up statement several months later, expressing concern that the commitments made at Jeddah had not been fulfilled. This statement was filed next to the previous statements, expressing concern about chemical weapons use, arbitrary detention, and the various other commitments that had not been fulfilled. International diplomatic archives are full of filed statements expressing concern. By the end of 2023, Captagon production in Syria was at or near its all-time high. The sanctions had not disrupted supply chains in any measurable way. The Arab League readmission had produced no documented reduction in production. The US Captagon Act, passed in December 2022 and signed into law, requiring the State Department to develop a counter-Captagon strategy, was a strategy document requirement, not a factory closing mechanism. There were billions of pills moving through the world. Soldiers had been among the first to use them in the Syrian conflict. But soldiers, it turned out, were a very small fraction of who was actually consuming what Syria was producing. The vast majority of those billions of pills were going somewhere else entirely. They were going to students, to workers, to people at parties in cities where the word Captagon meant something very different from what it meant on a battlefield. Somewhere in Amman, a 19-year-old engineering student was having the same night that thousands of students across the region were having. His parents had moved to Jordan from Syria 2 years earlier, when the war made staying impossible. His father worked in construction. His mother cleaned offices. The family lived in an apartment in Zarqa, a city outside the capital that had absorbed so many Syrian refugees it had developed its own dialect of grief. The boy had exams in 3 weeks, 5 courses. The material was dense, the professors moved fast, and the university library closed at 10. A classmate handed him something one afternoon in the parking lot. Small, round, white. "It's like coffee," the classmate said, "but it works." The boy had used coffee. Coffee did not keep him awake for 11 hours with his textbook open and his mind so clear it felt like someone had wiped a window from the inside. Coffee did not make the material feel interesting at midnight. Coffee did not make him feel at 2 a.m. with his notes spread across the kitchen table that he could do this, that he was going to pass, that he was, against all odds, against all the accumulated weight of the last 3 years, going to be fine. He took another one the next night. He was not unusual. He was, in the geography of the Middle East in the mid-2000s, extremely ordinary. The story the world told about Captagon was a war story. Fearless soldiers, battlefield invincibility, jihadists on pills. The imagery was dramatic and the reporting was real, but it captured perhaps 10% of what was actually happening with the drug by volume. The other 90% was sitting at kitchen tables, standing at construction sites at 4 a.m, dancing in apartments in Riyadh where the curtains were drawn, and someone had brought a bag of pills that went around the room like party favours. The drug of war framing was not wrong. It was just profoundly incomplete, and the incompleteness mattered because it shaped the policy response. When governments and media frame a drug as a weapon of war, the implicit solution is military or diplomatic. Sanction the producers, pressure the regime, tighten border enforcement. These are the levers you pull when the problem is a supply-side phenomenon driven by state actors. But when the primary driver is consumer demand, when tens of millions of ordinary people in Gulf states are reaching for a white pill because it helps them study, or work longer, or feel less lonely at a party, or get through the week, the supply-side levers are insufficient on their own. You can shut down a factory. You cannot shut down the reasons people want what the factory was making. The Gulf states, the primary consumer markets, found the drug of war framing convenient. It let them frame the problem as something arriving from outside rather than something growing from within. It positioned them as victims of Syrian, narco-state aggression rather than as participants in a consumer economy. The Saudi government could demand that Damascus address the Captagon trade without examining why Saudi Arabia had become the world's largest Captagon market. It is easier to sanction a general than to fund addiction treatment programs in a country where drug addiction is a moral failing rather than a medical condition. In Saudi Arabia, the demand structure had several distinct layers. At the top, young men with money, the children of merchant families, of government employees, of the oil economy's beneficiaries, people in their 20s with disposable income and long evenings, and the particular restlessness of a generation growing up in a wealthy country with strict public social rules and a great deal of time. The parties happened in private homes, in desert camps outside the cities, away from the ambient surveillance of urban Saudi society. Captagon was a social drug in these contexts. It made you talkative and energetic and interested in people, and capable of staying awake until 4 a.m. at a gathering without getting visibly sloppy in a way that would invite attention. Alcohol made you slur and stumble. Captagon made you look like you were in a very good mood. The distinction was not trivial in a society where the religious police, the mutaween, had historically enforced public morality codes with genuine teeth, and where the smell of alcohol could create consequences that a stimulant did not. Below that layer, workers. Saudi Arabia's economy runs substantially on migrant labour, construction, cleaning, logistics, delivery. The workers who built the towers and the stadiums and the roads were, in significant numbers, men from South Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, India, who had paid recruitment fees of several $1,000s to get their contracts, were working off the debt, were sending money home, and were operating on schedules that had not been designed with human sustainability in mind. A construction shift in Riyadh in summer is not a pleasant thing. The temperatures are not theoretical. The work does not pause because it is 43 degrees and humid. Captagon eliminated the body's insistence that it needed to stop. This is not a metaphor. The drug reduces fatigue signals, suppresses hunger, and maintains alertness through circumstances that would otherwise force a biological reckoning. For a worker on a 12-hour shift who could not afford to lose the shift, this had obvious appeal. The pill cost less than a meal. For some workers, the calculation was straightforward. Take the pill, skip the meal, complete the shift, keep the job. This is not, technically, what the West German pharmaceutical company had in mind when they designed it for children with attention problems. The health consequences of this, the cardiovascular stress of sustained amphetamine use, the malnutrition compounding stimulant crash, the dependency that developed over months of repeated use, arrived later. They arrived on bodies that were already depleted by conditions the workers had not been fully told about when they signed their contracts. In Jordan, which sat directly on the smuggling route between Syria and the Gulf, the problem had a different texture. Jordan's relationship with Captagon was not primarily about consumption, though consumption was present. It was about transit, and about the way transit over time becomes its own economy, with its own participants and its own incentives and its own communities of people whose livelihoods become entangled with keeping the product moving. The Jordanian border with Syria is a few hundred kilometres long. The terrain varies. The crossing points are established and monitored. The informal crossing points, trails through the hills, dried riverbeds, routes that have been used for generations to move things between Syria and Jordan without documentation, are also established and monitored by different parties. The Jordanian authorities seized billions of pills over the course of the conflict years. Record year after record year. The seizure statistics read like a growth chart for a particularly unfortunate industry. Jordan's security services reported their largest annual seizure totals in 2021 and 2022, figures running into the hundreds of millions of tablets. In a country of about 10 million people, almost every pill was in transit. The arithmetic of that number implied a production capacity in Syria that staggered the imagination. Jordan's imagination had been staggered for several years running. It was developing a tolerance. The smuggling itself had evolved into an art form. Early in the trade, the concealment methods were rudimentary. Pills in suitcases, pills in car door panels. The standard approaches of drug smuggling that every customs service in the world had long experienced detecting. By the late 2000s and 10s and into the 2020s, the concealment had become engineering. Engine blocks with cavities machined precisely to pill dimensions. Industrial machinery shipped as legitimate freight with hollow sections containing millions of tablets. Car bumpers, electrical transformers, bags of cement with pills distributed through the material, so no single X-ray slice showed a concentration. Furniture packed so densely with tablets that the furniture itself was the container. The pomegranates were the famous example, the most publicised seizure, the one that made news. But the pomegranates were not the most sophisticated method. They were the one that got caught. The methods that did not get caught were, by definition, not in the public record. The US Drug Enforcement Administration and Interpol produced reports estimating that global drug seizures across all substances capture somewhere between 10 and 20% of total shipments, which means the famous seizures, the engine blocks, the furniture, the fruit represented a fraction of what moved. For every pill intercepted, 4 to 19 arrived at their destination without ever meeting a customs agent. The math was not reassuring. The people doing the smuggling were not for the most part hardened criminals in the cinematic sense. They were truck drivers. They were farmers who supplemented income from fields that the war had made less productive. They were customs officials who had been paid enough that the alternative, honest poverty in a broken economy, no longer felt like a genuine option. They were men who knew someone, and the someone at the end of that chain had offered them more money than they would otherwise earn in 6 months for delivering a truck from one side of a border to the other. In a functioning economy, most of these men would not have made this choice. The economics would not have been compelling enough. The risk would have outweighed the reward. In the economies that the Syrian conflict had produced, in southern Syria, in the border regions of Jordan, in the Bekaa Valley, the calculus had shifted. The legitimate options had contracted. The families still needed feeding. The pill in the engine block was an abstract harm to someone far away. The empty refrigerator was a concrete harm to someone at the table. This is not an apology. It is a description of how drug economies recruit labour. They find the people whose options have narrowed and offer them the only expansion that is available. The typical Captagon smuggler arrested at a Jordanian checkpoint was not running an empire. He was running a truck. He was doing the same job he always did, except this load had a different cargo than what the paperwork said. Whether he knew the full extent of what he was carrying varied. Whether it mattered to the judge who processed his case also varied, and not always in his favour. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf states had implemented severe penalties for drug trafficking, decades in prison, in some cases capital punishment, partly as deterrence and partly as a response to public pressure from populations who could see the consequences of the trade without seeing its structural causes. The sentence fell on the truck driver. The network reorganized and found another truck driver. Back in Syria, the production had expanded far beyond what the 4th Division's original network had established. The protection racket model, the Assad apparatus providing security in exchange for a cut, had attracted factories throughout regime-held territory because the economics were too compelling to resist, and the alternative to participating was being shut down with no compensation and possible imprisonment. This is how protection rackets scale. Not through direct expansion by the protector, but through the gravitational pull of the economics. Every factory owner in regime-held Syria who was looking at a collapsing legitimate economy and access to a pill press was doing the same calculation, and the calculation had the same answer. The result was a distributed manufacturing network across Homs, Hama, parts of the Damascus countryside and coastal areas, each node operating with local logistics and feeding into the broader distribution system that the central networks managed. Estimates of Syrian production capacity ranged widely. The conservative figure suggested hundreds of millions of pills annually. The higher estimates ran into multiple billions. The actual number was somewhere in that range. The uncertainty itself said something. This was a drug economy so large that investigators tracking it from the outside couldn't see the edges. The chemistry of what was actually in the pills by this point was further from the original Captagon than it had ever been. The 1986 ban had ended genuine phenethylene production. What replaced it was primarily amphetamine mixed with caffeine and various binders. That was the standard formula from the late 1980s onward. By the 2010s and 2020s, the composition varied significantly by producer and by batch. Some pills were straightforward amphetamine, some contained methamphetamine. Some were a mixture of amphetamine precursors in various stages of synthesis, pressed into tablet form before the chemical process, was entirely complete. Quality control, in the pharmaceutical sense, did not exist. This mattered for users in ways that were not abstract. A pill that is supposed to be one thing and is actually something stronger is a pill that can kill you faster than expected. The cardiovascular stress of methamphetamine is meaningfully different from amphetamine. The dose-response curve is steeper. The margin between "this keeps me awake" and "this causes a cardiac event" is narrower. Dependency developed faster when the active compound was more potent than the user understood. Users who thought they were managing a mild stimulant use were sometimes managing something considerably more aggressive. The people who paid this price most directly were the recreational users, the students, the workers, the 90% who were not soldiers and who had no chain of command telling them what they had been given. The fighter who had been given Captagon on the battlefield came home to a different problem. Some of them did not come home at all, which was its own category of outcome. The ones who came back from years of conflict, those who had been on stimulants regularly through operations, who had used the drug not once or twice but hundreds of times over months of combat, found that the world they returned to had a texture the pill had trained them away from. The fear that the drug suppressed does not disappear. It waits. It is still there, on the other side of every operation, accumulating with interest. Fear is the body's record of what happened. The pill erased the file as it was being written. When it stopped, the system tried to reconstruct the files from fragments. This process is not smooth. The body that ran on chemical energy without sleep or food for months makes claims when the chemical is removed. It presents invoices. The nervous system that was repeatedly pushed past its natural limits has strong opinions about what happens next, and those opinions are expressed as insomnia, as tremors, as a sensitivity to ordinary stimuli that reads as threat when threat is no longer present. Stimulant psychosis, the paranoia, the hallucinations, the disordered thinking that can follow extended heavy amphetamine use, was documented in veterans of the Syrian conflict across multiple factions. Aid workers and psychiatrists treating former fighters in Turkish and Lebanese hospitals, in cities like Gaziantep, which had absorbed hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees, described patients who could not be easily distinguished in their clinical presentation from people experiencing acute schizophrenic episodes. They had not developed schizophrenia. They had developed the long-deferred bill for what the pill had done to their neurology. The pattern was consistent enough across multiple clinics and multiple accounts that humanitarian organizations began documenting it as a distinct post-conflict mental health presentation. Men in their 20s and 30s who could not be left alone, who could not sleep without sedation, who could not explain what they were afraid of because they were afraid of everything simultaneously. Men who had fought in conditions that would have broken most people, and who had been pharmacologically prevented from knowing that until it was too late to process it in any orderly way. The pill had been borrowed time. The repayment period had arrived. The men who had distributed the pills were not in the clinics. They were in government buildings, or in exile, or in the case of Maher al-Assad, on a sanctions list that had yet to produce any measurable change in their circumstances. In 2022, a researcher tracking Captagon seizure data across 12 countries published an analysis that attracted attention in policy circles. The numbers showed that annual global seizures had roughly doubled in each of the preceding 3 years. Doubled. Each year. For 3 years running. Not a slight increase. Not a moderate uptick. A doubling, annually, in the visible fraction of the trade, and seizures by definition represent only what was caught. The total production was a multiple of the total seized. If the seized amount was doubling each year, and the seized amount was somewhere between 10 and 20% of total production, then total production was growing even faster than the seizure data suggested. The analysis concluded, with the careful language of researchers who understand they are writing about things that make governments uncomfortable, that the Captagon trade had become the dominant illicit drug economy in the Middle East and North Africa by total value. It had exceeded heroin. It had exceeded hashish. It had exceeded synthetic cannabinoids and prescription opioids and the various stimulant markets that had existed in the region for decades. It had exceeded everything. The league table of regional drug economies had a new champion. Nobody held a ceremony, a pill, whose name referred to a chemical that no longer existed in it, manufactured in the ruins of a war-destroyed country, distributed through networks run by a government and a political military organization, consumed primarily by students and workers and young people at parties. This was now the region's most significant drug economy by a considerable margin. By some estimates, it was generating more annual revenue than the legitimate gross domestic product of several of the countries it passed through en route to its consumers. Syria's Captagon industry was, by 2022, worth somewhere between $5 and $6 billion annually. The entire legitimate Syrian economy, in the same period, was producing less. The drug had become Syria's most significant export by value. The factories running on chemical precursors from China and Asia, pressing out tablets at a fraction of a cent each and selling them for multiples of their production cost across 3 continents, had become the economic backbone of a country that had no other functional backbone left. The international community, which had spent years arguing about whether to engage or isolate the Assad regime, had been somewhat slow to reckon with the fact that the regime had quietly solved its own revenue problem. International sanctions were designed for economies connected to international financial systems. The Captagon trade ran on cash, on informal value transfer, on payments made in currencies that never passed through a bank that had Western correspondent relationships. You cannot sanction what you cannot find in the system, and the system, it turned out, was not the one the sanctions were designed for. And then, in late 2024, the thing that had seemed impossible happened. The Assad regime fell, not gradually, not through a negotiated transition, not through the kind of slow political erosion that sometimes ends long authoritarian governments, not through the diplomatic pressure that the Arab League and the United States and the European Union had been applying in their various ways for the preceding 3 years. Fast, incomprehensibly fast. The rebel offensive that began in late November 2024, led primarily by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the organisation that controlled Idlib province in northwestern Syria, alongside allied factions, moved through Aleppo in days. Aleppo, Syria's second city, and a place that the regime had spent 3 years besieging and retaking during the earlier phases of the conflict, fell in less than a week. Then Hama, then Homs. Then the road to Damascus was open. The offensive moved so quickly that outside observers, diplomats, intelligence analysts, journalists who had covered the Syrian conflict for a decade, were visibly struggling to keep up with what was happening. The regime's army, which on paper remained a substantial force, dissolved rather than fought. Units surrendered without significant resistance. Officers disappeared. The Russian and Iranian support that had kept Assad in power through the previous decade did not materialize in time or in sufficient quantity to change the outcome. On December 8, 2024, Bashar al-Assad boarded a plane in Damascus. He flew to Moscow. He did not announce a resignation. He did not give a final address to the nation. He did not hold a last cabinet meeting or sign any documents handing over power. He did not apparently leave a note. He simply left. The 4th Armoured Division, the most powerful military unit in Syria, the organisation whose command structure had provided the protection architecture for the world's most significant Captagon operation for nearly a decade, dissolved within days. Soldiers abandoned checkpoints. Officers removed their uniforms. Maher al-Assad, the man the United States had sanctioned 7 months earlier for running the drug trade, left the country alongside or shortly after his brother. His whereabouts, as of the following weeks, were unclear. The factories were unguarded. The distribution networks had lost their protector. The checkpoints through which the trucks had been moving, trucks carrying pomegranates and engine blocks and furniture and industrial machinery, trucks whose paperwork said one thing and whose cargo said another, were now staffed by different people or not staffed at all, and nobody knew what happened next. Not the new Syrian government that was being assembled in Damascus, not the drug enforcement agencies in Riyadh and Amman that had been tracking the trade for years, not the analysts in Washington who had spent 3 years building a counter-Captagon strategy that had been predicated on the regime it was designed to counter still being in power. The assumption that had underpinned everything, that the Captagon economy was a regime economy and that the regime was a fixed variable, and that regime change was not on the near-term table, had dissolved in the same 10 days that the 4th Division had dissolved. The Captagon Empire had lost its government. What it hadn't lost was its factories, its distribution networks, its consumer base of tens of millions of people across the Gulf, and the economic desperation of the Syrian population that had been manufacturing the product for a decade. Those things were still there, waiting to see who would step into the space the Assads had left. The new government arrived in Damascus on December 8th, 2024, and found a country that was a complete surprise. Not the physical destruction, that was expected. 13 years of war had left visible scars on every city. The craters, the stripped buildings, the infrastructure that had been bombed, shelled, or simply neglected into failure. The hospitals that had been bombed twice and repaired once and bombed again. The school in Aleppo where classes had resumed in 2019 on the ground floor because the upper floors were too dangerous to use. The roads that had not been maintained since 2012 and showed it. None of that was a surprise. The people who had fought to take Damascus knew what the war had done. What the new government did not expect or had not fully modelled was the economy they were inheriting. The legitimate economy of Syria was essentially nothing. The banks had been hollowed out by years of sanctions, capital flight and regime extraction. The pound was worth a fraction of what it had been worth before the war. A fraction of a fraction, actually, having undergone several additional devaluation cycles since the early years of the conflict. The educated professional class, the doctors, engineers, lawyers, academics, had largely left to Turkey, to Lebanon, to Germany, to Canada, to anywhere that was not this. What remained was informality, grey markets, the survival economy of a population that had spent 13 years learning to live without functional institutions, because the functional institutions had been instruments of the regime, and the regime had been the problem. Governance manuals do not have a good chapter on inheriting a state that has been simultaneously a war machine, a drug cartel, and a humanitarian catastrophe. The HTS leadership was working from improvised frameworks and international goodwill that came with a very clear expiration date. And underneath all of it, running in parallel, was the other economy, the one that had been generating $5 to $6 billion a year. The one whose factories were still standing, whose supply chains were still intact, whose distribution networks were, as of the second week of December, simply waiting to see who was in charge now. The new leadership centred on Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and its commander Ahmed al-Shara, who had spent years fighting under the name Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, understood that they were being watched, not just by Syrians, by the entire international community, which had spent decades wrestling with the question of whether HTS was a terrorist organisation, a pragmatic governance actor, an Islamist movement with roots in Al-Qaeda, a transitional force that had evolved beyond those roots, or some combination of all four simultaneously. The United States had designated HTS, as a foreign terrorist organisation. The European Union had similar designations. These designations created a problem you cannot easily work with, fund, recognise or reconstruct a country being governed by an organisation on your terrorism list. To have those designations reconsidered, the new Syrian government needed to demonstrate behaviour that merited reconsideration. A short list of what that meant in practice: no attacks on minorities, no harbour for international terror networks, cooperation with the investigation of chemical weapons stockpiles, and, prominent on the agenda of Gulf allies whose support the new government badly needed, a serious effort against the Captagon trade. Al-Shara moved quickly on the optics. Public statements about dismantling the drug trade came within the first weeks. Symbolic raids on facilities were announced with photographs. Factories were publicly destroyed, bulldozed, burned, documented for the cameras. Promises were made directly to Jordan's King Abdullah and to Saudi officials that the new Syria would not inherit the narco-state model of its predecessor. The promises were noted. They were noted with the particular attentiveness of governments that had been taking notes on Syrian promises for 14 years. The factories that were destroyed in the announcements were a small and carefully selected fraction of the facilities that existed. The larger network, the production hubs in Homs province, the facilities in the Damascus countryside, the operations in the coastal areas near Tartus and Latakia, where regime loyalists still had influence, remained. Some were being protected by local power brokers who had not been fully integrated into the new governance structure and who had no particular interest in destroying the most profitable industry in the territory they controlled. Progress was real in some areas. In others, the announcement was the progress. Here is the problem with promising to dismantle a $5 billion economy in a country with no functional alternative. The people who worked in those factories needed to eat. The factory workers, the chemists, the press operators, the packers, the logistics coordinators were not ideologically committed to the Captagon trade. They had not joined the amphetamine industry out of enthusiasm for the product. They had joined because the factory paid and nothing else did. In a post-Assad Syria with no reconstruction funding yet committed, with international sanctions still partially in place, with a devastated legitimate economy and a population of several million people who needed employment, the $5 billion industry sitting in the middle of it was not just a crime problem, it was a labour market. Destroying a factory employs no one. The workers go home, they look at the market offers nothing. The network that built the first factory is still there. The equipment can be replaced. The precursor supply chains are still intact. Those run through global chemical trade routes that are difficult to shut down without disrupting legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturing. The reconstruction of what was just destroyed takes less time than the original construction. Drug enforcement agencies have been learning this lesson since Prohibition. They keep being surprised by it. This is the structural trap of drug eradication in economies that have been destroyed by conflict. The logic of enforcement assumes you are working against an embedded criminal operation that needs to be dismantled. The logic is not wrong, but it misses the other logic, that the criminal operation is also the jobs program, the bank, and in some cases the only functioning economic institution left. You cannot arrest your way out of a labour market problem. You can make it more expensive to operate the factory. You can raise the risk premium on every stage of the supply chain. You can increase the price of the pill at the consumer end, which reduces consumption somewhat and makes the trade marginally less profitable. None of this eliminates the trade, it adjusts the parameters. The people who benefit from the trade at the production end, the factory workers, the logistics operators, the local power brokers who take a protection fee, will absorb higher risk premiums up to the point where a better alternative exists. When no better alternative exists, they absorb them indefinitely. Jordan watched all of this very carefully. Jordan's relationship with Syria has always been one of cautious proximity. Two countries that share a border, a language, a great deal of history, and a permanent tension about what happens on either side of the line between them. Jordan had absorbed somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million Syrian refugees by the mid-2000s in a country of only 10 million people. It had built camps and strained services and generated resentment and demonstrated remarkable pragmatic resilience in roughly equal measure. Jordan's intelligence services had been tracking the Captagon trade longer than almost anyone, and with a specificity that came from geography. The product passed through Jordanian territory. The distribution route from Syrian factories to Gulf consumers ran largely through Jordan, which meant Jordanian customs officials were on the front line. Jordanian truck drivers were among the people arrested for smuggling, and Jordanian border towns had developed the particular economy that emerges when a major transit trade passes through. Low-level facilitation, money-changing storage, the quiet participation of people who were not primarily criminals but were primarily broke. The Jordanian government had lobbied Washington and Brussels for years about Captagon. It had the data, it had the seizure records, it had the economic impact analysis. It had, in King Abdullah, a monarch who was personally engaged on the issue and was not shy about raising it in bilateral meetings. Amman's concern in early 2025 was not ideological, it was logistical. The collapse of the Assad protection structure had not, as far as Jordanian intelligence could determine, resulted in a corresponding collapse of Captagon shipments. The flows had interrupted briefly, days, maybe 2 weeks, during the maximum chaos of the transition period, when the checkpoints were unstaffed and the 4th Division had dissolved and nobody was quite sure who was controlling which road. Then the flows had resumed. Not at previous levels, not immediately. But the direction was clear. The networks had not dissolved. They had reorganized. Some of the same logistics operators who'd been moving product under the 4th Division's protection were now moving product under different arrangements, with different local commanders providing different versions of the same service. The Captagon trade had changed management. It had not changed business models. Jordan filed this observation alongside its seizure records. Both were growing. The consumer market, meanwhile, had not received the memo about regime change. In Riyadh, in Jeddah, in Amman, in Cairo, in the UAE, the demand for Captagon did not fluctuate with the political news from Damascus. The student with the exam in 3 weeks did not reconsider his purchase because the Assad family had fled to Moscow. The construction worker did not pass on the pill because the Captagon Act required the State Department to produce a strategic assessment. The young man at the private gathering outside Jeddah did not decline what was being passed around because Maher al-Assad was on a sanctions list. These people were not following the geopolitics of their supply chain. Nobody does. This is the basic arithmetic of consumer drug markets that policy discussions consistently struggle to absorb. It is not a cynical observation, it is a structural one. Supply-side disruptions cause temporary price increases and temporary shortages. They do not cause demand reductions. The demand is driven by conditions, economic pressure, exam culture, labour exploitation, social dynamics, the particular loneliness of certain kinds of nights, that are entirely independent of who is running the factories. In the months after Assad fell, analysts noted a brief, modest increase in Captagon street prices in Gulf markets. The shock had reached consumers in the form of slightly reduced availability and slightly higher cost. This is what partial supply interruption looks like from the consumer end. The prices came back down. A different supplier had found the gap. The gap was the same shape it had always been. The gap was the shape of the demand. If anything, the chaos of the transition created a temporary opening for new sourcing. Drug markets abhor a vacuum with the same reliable thoroughness as nature. When one supplier is disrupted, the market generates price signals that attract alternatives. By early 2025, there were indicators of Captagon-branded pills moving through additional channels from Lebanon, where production capacity in the Bekaa Valley had always existed alongside Syrian supply, and from other regional sources that had previously been undersupplied by Syria's dominance. The Syrian Captagon Empire had not been replaced. It was being succeeded, slowly, imperfectly, with new players and new logistics and new arrangements, but succeeded. The humanitarian cost across all of this had been building for years and was not finished building. The fighters who had used Captagon through the conflict, the men in their 20s and 30s in Turkish and Lebanese clinics and makeshift hospitals, were not the largest category of people the drug had damaged. They were the most visible, the most dramatic, the easiest to write about, because they provided the narrative that the drug of war framing required. Fearless soldiers, battlefield invincibility, the horror of what chemistry had been conscripted into. You could write that story in 7 paragraphs and have a compelling article. The larger category was quieter. It did not have a military angle. It did not come with dramatic eyewitness accounts of fighters laughing during firefights. It came with medical charts, with dependency assessments, with the particular statistics of a public health problem that a region had decided, for cultural and political reasons, to treat as a law enforcement problem. It was the young Saudi man who had started using Captagon at university parties in 2016, and by 2021 was using it daily, and by 2023 had a cardiovascular profile that a cardiologist would describe with clinical restraint as a source of significant concern. Elevated blood pressure, irregular rhythm under stress, a heart that was doing the work it had been asked to do and showing the wear. He had never held a gun. He had never been near a battlefield. He'd found a pill that made the anxiety go away and the evening feel like something, and then found that the pill required more pills, and then found that the life he'd been building had quietly restructured itself around the availability of the pill without his fully noticing until the restructuring was complete. In a society where addiction is a moral failing and not a medical condition, where the official position on drugs is that they are a foreign contamination of a pure social order, this man did not seek treatment. The treatment infrastructure for stimulant dependency in Saudi Arabia in 2023 was limited in ways that reflected how long the official position had denied the problem's existence. He sought more pills. It was the Bangladeshi construction worker in Riyadh who had used Captagon to extend his working capacity across 4 years of 12-hour shifts, sending money home every month, slowly paying off the recruitment debt he'd taken on, building infrastructure he would never use in a city where his visa did not permit him to remain permanently, who returned home to Dhaka with savings that felt like an accomplishment and a cardiovascular system that had been running on amphetamines for 4 years without anyone formally monitoring what that meant, who experienced the crash of withdrawal as a mysterious illness rather than a recognized condition, because nobody at the recruitment agency had told him what the foreman's informal performance enhancement actually was. These stories were not in the seizure reports. They were not in the US Treasury sanctions announcements. They were not in the congressional testimony about the Captagon Act. They were just happening, in the background, in the ordinary ongoing way of consequences that arrive long after the decisions that produced them. By mid-2025, the international assessment of the Captagon situation was caught between 2 frameworks that were both true and both insufficient. Framework 1, the Assad regime had been the central organising force of the Captagon trade. The protection structure, the distribution, architecture, the state-level insulation from interdiction, all of this had depended on the 4th Division, on Maher's command, on the specific organisational structure of the Assad government. With the regime gone and the 4th Division dissolved, The trade had lost its backbone. Given sustained pressure on the new Syrian government, serious investment in legitimate economic alternatives, and continued border enforcement by Jordan and the Gulf states, the trade would eventually decline. It would take years. But the structural disruption was real, and the trajectory was downward. Framework 2. The trade had grown so large, so fast, for so long, and had put down such deep roots in so many parallel economies, that the removal of the Assad protection structure was a disruption rather than a solution. A significant disruption, genuinely costly to the networks that had relied on the regime umbrella. But the factories, the chemical supply chains, the distribution networks, the consumer demand of tens of millions of people, the labour pool of a shattered Syrian economy with no alternative employment, all of these existed independently of any particular family's political control. The Captagon trade was not a tree. It was a root system. You could cut the trunk. The roots remained. Both frameworks were right about what they described. They disagreed about which factor was dominant. The evidence from the first 6 months after Assad's fall was ambiguous enough that serious analysts disagreed about what it showed. Seizure volumes at Jordanian and Saudi borders had dropped briefly in December 2024, the 2 or 3 weeks of maximum chaos around the transition, and then had climbed back toward previous levels, not immediately to the same volumes, but trending upward. New sourcing arrangements were appearing in the seizure data. Pills from Lebanese sources, moving through routes that had been secondary before. Pills with slightly different chemical signatures, suggesting new production facilities coming online. The Syrian dominance of the trade was dented. The trade itself was not dented in proportion. The comedy in all of this, and there was comedy, in the dark and cosmic sense that only applies to situations where the absurdity has become so total that laughter is the only available response that doesn't require you to lie down on the floor, was the gap between the institutional responses and the structural reality. International sanctions against a man who had already fled to Russia, a strategy document requirement directed at a government that had ceased to exist, an Arab League condition attached to a handshake with a president who was, as the handshake was being photographed, approximately 6 months away from boarding a plane. A US law requiring a counter-Captagon approach developed for a trade architecture that had already partially dissolved by the time the strategy documents were due. Each of these responses had been correct for the situation it was designed to address. Each of them had arrived at approximately the moment the situation changed. This is not unique to Captagon. This is not unique to Syria. This is not even unusual. This is the standard operating speed of international institutions responding to drug economies. Drug economies run on market time. Fast, adaptive, constantly reorganizing around obstacles. The supply chain that gets disrupted on Tuesday has a workaround by Thursday. The smuggler arrested on Wednesday has been replaced by Saturday. The factory shut down in Homs in March is rebuilt in the Damascus countryside by June, using a different operator, the same equipment, the same precursor suppliers, and the same distribution contacts. International institutions run on bureaucratic time, slow, sequential, requiring consensus across multiple governments with different interests, different domestic political pressures, and different definitions of what success looks like. Writing. Reports that are accurate when they are finalised and somewhat outdated by the time they are distributed, and significantly outdated by the time they are acted upon. The pill moves faster than the policy. It always has. The 1986 ban on phenethylline, the decision that ended legitimate Captagon production and handed the market to whoever would fill it, was made by a committee that had been watching stimulant trends for years. The committee made the right call on the drug. It did not fully model what would fill the gap. The gap was filled within months. Everything that followed, the underground production, the Bulgarian factories, the Syrian war economy, the Assad family's billions, the Jordanian seizure records, the pomegranate shipments, the hollowed engine blocks, followed from a committee that moved at bureaucratic speed, responding to a market that moved at market speed. The pill was faster. It was always faster. The student in Amman finished his exams in January 2025. He passed. His engineering grades were adequate. Not spectacular, but adequate. He had used the pills 4 times during the exam period. The first time, the 11 hours of clear focus had felt like something close to miraculous, like discovering a room in his own brain he hadn't known existed. The room had always been there. The pill had just lit it. The second time, he needed to study for 12 hours, not 11, and the pill made that possible. The third time, he noticed he couldn't sleep well afterward. He lay awake in the apartment in Zarqa, and his thoughts moved faster than he wanted them to move, and the ceiling didn't help. The fourth time, 2 days before the last exam, he took 2 because 1 didn't feel like enough anymore. He told himself he would stop after exams. He had heard this was something people told themselves. His classmate, who had first handed him the pill in the parking lot, had been taking them for 2 years. The classmate studied less efficiently than he had. Before he started, the edge had dulled, the focus was harder to summon, the 11-hour sessions had become irregular and unreliable in ways they hadn't been at the beginning. But he also felt on the days he didn't take one, like something was slightly wrong with everything. A film over the world. A flatness where there should have been colour. A sense that the version of himself that existed without the pill was a diminished version of something that had been fuller once. He could not remember clearly when the fuller version had been the normal one. The classmate did not describe this as addiction. He described it as needing to be functional. The pill, he said, was just how things were now. The student listened to this. He thought about the 11 hours of clear focus on the first night, the room in his brain that the pill had lit, the particular quality of attention that had felt like himself but more, like the best version of a thing he had always been. He thought about the 2 pills on the 4th night and the ceiling afterward, and the thoughts moving faster than he wanted. He didn't say anything. He had 3 months before the next exam cycle. He thought he would probably be fine. There is a specific human capacity that the Captagon story keeps running into. The capacity to look at something that is clearly, structurally, historically a problem, and believe that it will not be a problem for you. Not because you are foolish, not because you haven't heard the warnings, but because the version of yourself that encounters the drug feels capable, feels clear, feels, in the precise way the pill was designed to make you feel, like the obstacle you are worried about is actually manageable. Like you are one of the people who can handle this. The pill doesn't lie to you. That's the thing nobody says clearly enough. It delivers what it promises. The 11 hours of clear focus are real. The fearless soldier is real. Not a hallucination, not a fantasy, but a genuinely altered state in which the biological signals that would normally cause retreat or hesitation have been suppressed by a chemical that knows exactly how to suppress them. The construction worker who extends his shift by 4 hours is genuinely working. The student who finishes the chapter at 3 in the morning is genuinely studying. What is not discussed in the marketing being in this case a classmate in a parking lot, or a militia commander distributing pills before an operation, or a factory foreman who offers something for the long shift, is the other side of the account. The clarity is borrowed. The fearlessness is borrowed. The energy is borrowed from a biological budget that has been accumulating these withdrawals without sending monthly statements. The bill arrives when the budget decides, not when the borrower plans for it. And the interest that has been running in the background, the cardiovascular stress, the neurological adjustment, the dependency that has been forming so gradually that it never felt like formation, is presented in full at the moment of least convenience. The pill doesn't lie. It just omits the repayment terms. Every person who has ever taken it and felt good understood intellectually that this was the case. Every person who has ever taken it and felt good believed experientially that their situation was different, that the repayment when it came would be manageable, that they were not the kind of person the warnings were written for. This is not a character flaw. It is a feature of how borrowed capability feels from the inside. It feels like yours. The clarity feels like your clarity. The fearlessness feels like your courage. The 11 hours of focus feel like your mind finally working the way your mind was supposed to work all along. The pill gave you back something you thought you'd lost, or showed you something you thought you'd never had. How do you stop taking something that shows you the version of yourself you've always wanted to be? You don't easily. Not without understanding in advance that the version was always borrowed. That the room the pill lit was lit with someone else's electricity running on a meter you were not told about, and the bill would come. That is what nobody in the parking lot tells you. It is what every clinic in Turkey and Lebanon and Riyadh and Amman is discovering, one patient at a time, in the slow and unannounced repayment period that follows the thing that nobody announced was coming. The chemists at Degussa AG in Frankfurt in 1961 were not thinking about any of this. They were thinking about the mechanism, the prodrug structure, the question of whether routing the stimulant release through a two-stage metabolic process would smooth the onset curve in a way that reduced cardiovascular stress. They were thinking about the patients who needed this, children who could not sit still in classrooms designed for children who could, adults whose narcolepsy made driving impossible, people whose depression had become so heavy it had consumed the energy needed to treat itself. These were real problems. The chemists were genuinely trying to solve them. They were good at their jobs. The molecule they designed worked. The prodrug structure did produce a smoother onset. The combination of amphetamine and theophylline did create a different stimulation profile from straight amphetamine. The patients who received Captagon in clinical settings reported genuine relief. In the pharmacological sense, the molecule was a success. The pathway from a Frankfurt laboratory bench in 1961 to a checkpoint outside Homs in 2013 passes through. The legitimate pharmaceutical distribution networks of 2 continents, the exam culture of an entire region, a United Nations conference room where a committee with the best available data made a decision with incomplete model of second-order effects, the underground manufacturing networks of Eastern Europe, the geographical accident of Syria's location at the centre of the Middle East's most traversable smuggling routes, the specific brutality and opportunism of a particular family, and a civil war that consumed a country of 22 million people and left behind in its ruins an industry. None of those steps were inevitable. Each was a decision made by a person or an institution that could have gone differently. The chemists in Frankfurt could not have been expected to trace this path. They were solving the problem in front of them. The problem in front of each subsequent decision-maker was also real. The UN committee was right that the drug had abuse potential. The Syrian factory owner was right that the economics were compelling. The militia commander was right that the pill kept his fighters functional. The student in Zaka was right that the exam pressure was genuine. Everyone was responding reasonably to the situation in front of them. The situation in front of all of them, in aggregate, was a catastrophe. This is a pattern that appears so frequently in human history that it has acquired several names. Tragedy of the commons, systems failure, unintended consequences. The names vary. The structure is the same, a collection of individually rational decisions producing a collectively irrational outcome. The molecule in 1961 was not the problem. The molecule was just the first domino. The rest of them knocked themselves down. Here is what every stimulant war story in the last 100 years has in common. someone discovered that a chemical could bridge the gap between what human beings are capable of and what a particular situation demands of them. And someone else, a general, a factory owner, an exam committee, a militia commander, a site foreman at a construction project in a Gulf city, decided that the gap was their problem to close and the chemical was their solution. The British soldiers who flew over the English Channel in 1940 were given benzodrine tablets by the RAF Medical Corps. Standard issue. The logic was that keeping pilots awake and alert saved aircraft and won engagements. The German military distributed Pervitin, methamphetamine packaged in small foil tubes marketed under the brand name Panzer Schokolade, which translates as tank chocolate, to soldiers before and during the invasion of France in 1940. 62 days. France fell. The drug had helped maintain the operational tempo that the campaign required. Both sides were doing it. Both sides believed they had found a legitimate edge. The edge, it turned out, came with terms and conditions. Neither side had read them. The American military used amphetamines through the Korean War and Vietnam, through Gulf I and Gulf II. The US Air Force maintained a program of what it called go pills, dextroamphetamine prescribed by flight surgeons for long missions, well into the 2000s. The program produced several friendly fire incidents in Afghanistan, in one case with Canadian soldiers, that led to a congressional inquiry and a policy review. The policy was adjusted. The need for extended operational capacity remained. Every generation has reached for this. The Captagon story is not an outlier. It is the most recent iteration of a pattern so old and so consistent that it has earned the right to be called a human tendency rather than a historical accident. We keep discovering that we need more than we have. We keep finding the chemical that bridges the gap. We keep learning what the bridge costs. We keep forgetting, one generation later, that we learned it. The specific chemical changes. The underlying transaction is identical. We need you to be more than you are, and here is a compound that will let you be that, and we will not mention what it costs. The cost arrives later. It always arrives later. The armies move on. The wars end or evolve into new configurations. The factories close or change hands or are rebuilt by whoever has inherited the territory and the equipment. The people who paid the actual price, the soldiers whose neurological baselines were rewritten, the workers whose hearts were worn down before their time, the students who discovered that the room the pill had lit was harder to reach without it, are not in the historical summaries. They are not in the seizure statistics. They're not in the congressional testimony. They are in the repayment period. That period is quiet. It does not hold press conferences, it simply continues. The new Syria in 2025 was a project of extraordinary ambiguity. It might work. Countries have been rebuilt from worse. Germany was rubble in 1945 and was producing automobiles and writing constitutions within a decade. Lebanon had a civil war from 1975 to 1990, absorbed the violence, and rebuilt enough of a functioning city in Beirut that people came back. Rwanda experienced a genocide in 1994 that killed somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 people in 100 days, and built one of the most administratively functional states in Africa over the following 30 years. History is not without examples of reconstruction that succeeded, and succeeded from very dark starting points. What Syria had that those examples did not in the same concentrated form was a $5 billion illegal economy woven into the ruins of its legitimate one, not sitting alongside it, easily separable, woven into it, the same truck drivers, the same border crossings, the same networks of operators and facilitators and low-level participants whose livelihoods had been shaped by the trade for a decade. The HTS government was making promises. The international community was extending cautious engagement. The kind of engagement that keeps one hand on the exit while extending the other for a handshake. American officials visited Damascus. European officials visited Damascus. Aid organisations that had been operating in opposition areas for years expanded carefully into government-held territory. The Captagon issue was on every agenda. It appeared in every joint communiqué. Al-Shara mentioned it in virtually every international meeting unprompted, because he understood that it was the credential the international community needed to see before it could justify anything more substantive. Progress was real in some areas. In Idlib, where HTS had governed for years, the trade had always been more controlled. The organisation had made a strategic calculation early on that running a drug empire created more problems than it solved for a group trying to present itself as a governance actor. But Idlib was not all of Syria. The coastal areas, where Assad loyalists retained influence, and where the 4th Division's networks had been strongest, were not under consolidated central authority. The Damascus countryside, where much of the production infrastructure was concentrated, was in a complex patchwork of newly established control that changed week by week. The international community continued to watch. It had been watching Syria for 14 years. Its watching had produced a chemical weapons agreement that was violated, a diplomatic engagement that Assad used as a negotiating chip, sanctions that inconvenienced no one who mattered, and a Captagon Act that produced a strategy document requirement. The international community is very good at watching. The watching does not stop the presses. The factories, some of them, were still running. Not all of them. The HTS government had genuinely shut down facilities in the areas it controlled most tightly, and the shutdowns were real enough that regional enforcement agencies noted a measurable reduction in pills with certain chemical signatures, indicators of specific production locations that had been active before and had gone quiet. But Syria is a large country. It had spent a decade building production infrastructure specifically designed to be distributed, redundant and invisible to outside observers, not one factory. Dozens of facilities, varying in size from industrial operations to converted workshops, spread across multiple governorates and multiple jurisdictions that the new central government did not yet reliably control. The facilities that the HTS government couldn't reach, in the coastal areas, in the eastern territories, in the patchwork zones where authority was contested, were not idle. They were recalibrating. The precursor, chemicals, had not stopped arriving. The supply chain for amphetamine synthesis runs through legitimate global pharmaceutical trade. The starting materials are compounds with real medical applications, produced in China and India and elsewhere, that flow through Turkish and Lebanese intermediaries into Syria. Closing that supply chain requires the cooperation of multiple countries with competing economic interests and varying levels of motivation. The cooperation was partial. The supply chain was partially intact. The presses kept pressing, not as fast, not as many. The production curve had bent. Whether it would continue to bend or would find its floor and begin climbing again under new management was the question that nobody had answered yet. In Riyadh, in Amman, in Jeddah, in the cities where the product arrived in engine blocks and furniture and the occasional piece of fruit, the consumer market continued. The seizures continued. Record years were still being broken in Jordan and Saudi Arabia, though the trajectory had flattened slightly from its previous steep upward climb. Enforcement agencies reported cautious, qualified optimism, the kind of optimism that comes with the phrase "too early to say" attached, because the people who had been doing this work long enough had learned what happened to optimism that declared victory prematurely. The seizures were the visible fraction. Behind each seized shipment were the unseized ones. Behind each arrested smuggler was the network that would replace him within days. Behind each closed factory was the demand that had created it, which had not closed with the factory. The student in Zarqa bought pills twice more in April. He told himself this was occasional use. Occasional use was fine. Lots of people use things occasionally. Coffee was a stimulant after all, and nobody convened international committees about coffee. The comparison he was making was not a good comparison. He knew this, in the way you know things when you're not looking directly at them. The pills that arrived in Zarqa had been manufactured somewhere in Syria, in a facility that no longer operated under any government's protection or official sanction, but that operated because the equipment still worked and the precursor chemicals were still arriving and the demand was still creating the economics that made the whole system run. The student took one. The clarity came. The room in his brain lit up, and the problems in the textbook rearranged themselves into something solvable, and the 3 hours that followed had the particular quality he'd come to rely on. The quality of being the version of himself he most wanted to be. It was not fake. It was real. He sat under the lamp in the apartment in Zarqa where his father paid the rent with construction wages, and his mother slept early because she started cleaning offices at 5 a.m, and he worked. He was a good student when the pill was working. He was going to be an engineer. He was going to do something with his life that his family could point to and say, this is what it was for. The displacement, the border, the apartment in Zarqa, the construction shifts. This is what it was for. The pill helped him believe this was possible. Whether he was borrowing the belief or earning it was a question he had not yet had reason to ask. This is the story of Captagon, a molecule synthesized in 1961 to help people function, banned in 1986 when it was decided that its function was being misused, continued underground as a ghost name on a pill that no longer contained the original compound, weaponized by a civil war that needed fighters who could not feel fear, industrialized by a family that needed revenue the international community could not freeze, consumed by tens of millions of people who needed to get through exams, through shifts, through evenings, through wars. The pill is still here. The Assad family is in Moscow. The 4th Division is dissolved. The pomegranate shipments that made international headlines are past. The sanctions are filed. The strategy documents are produced. The Arab League summits have happened. The pill is still here. It is in the Bekaa Valley and the Damascus countryside and the engine blocks moving through Jordanian customs. It is in the apartments in Riyadh and the construction sites in Jeddah and the exam halls in Amman. It is in the supply chains that were built over a decade and did not dissolve when the government that built them fled to Moscow. The pill is still here because the need is still here. Not the need for a particular molecule, the need for what the molecule represents, the need to close the gap between what the situation demands and what the body can provide. The need, which is ancient and universal and not reducible to any particular policy intervention, to feel, for a few hours at a time, for the cost of a small white tablet, like the version of yourself you always suspected you could be. Chemistry did not create this need. Chemistry found it. Chemistry has been finding it, in one form or another, since human beings first chewed the right plant and noticed something changed. The specific compound varies across centuries. The underlying hunger is the same. Every society in human history has reached for some version of this. The question has never been whether people will seek chemical assistance with the gap between capability and demand. The question has always been, under what conditions, at what cost, and who pays? The student in Zarqa is paying in installments he has not fully calculated yet. The construction worker in Riyadh paid in ways he cannot name to a doctor who would not have recognized the condition. The soldier at the checkpoint paid in a clinic in Gaziantep where the lights were too bright and everything felt like a threat. The chemist in Frankfurt were trying to help. The committee in 1986 was trying to help. The international community, in its slow and institutional way, was trying to help. Nobody was trying to produce what was produced. Nobody was trying to produce a $6 billion criminal economy that outlasted the regime it was built around, that continued running after the government fled, that was being consumed in the same week by a student trying to pass engineering exams and a soldier still paying the bill for a war that was technically over. But here we are, the pill is still here, and somewhere in Syria, in a facility that does not appear on any map that any government has acknowledged, a press is producing the same small white tablet that a child in Frankfurt was supposed to take with a glass of water to help him sit still in class. The child in Frankfurt is in his 80s now, if he's still alive. He never knew what the molecule became. The press is still running. The distance between those two facts is everything. It is the entire story. It is also in the way of things that are entirely predictable and entirely preventable, and that happened anyway, somehow still surprising. Somehow, with all of human history as our guide, with every previous iteration of this exact story written in the histories of every army that distributed stimulants and every generation that banned them and every market that continued regardless, we're still surprised. That might be the most human thing in the whole story. Not the greed, not the war, not the family that ran a country as a drug operation. The surprise. The persistent, renewable, apparently inexhaustible surprise that this time it would be different.